So this kind of speaks to my heart a little bit because I wasn't an engineer. I didn't study computer programming. I love technology, but I've been a venture investor pretty much my whole career. I'm very much like more commercially trained, if that makes sense. All right, today I'm going to react to some TikToks that are taken from one of my favorite podcasts out there, the All In podcast, which you should check out. If you don't follow it, you don't listen to it, you definitely should. It's comprised of four of these guys from Silicon Valley that are phenomenal investors. You have people like Chamath, who was one of the early employees at Facebook and has built his fund Social Capital and done incredibly well investing in some amazing companies. You have people like Jason Calacanis, who was one of the early investors in Uber, among a wide range of other companies, a very prolific angel investor. You have people like David Sachs, who is one of the early employees at PayPal, went on to start a company called Yammer, which was like Slack in the days before Slack, and sold that business for $1 billion to Microsoft. And David Rosenberg, who's one of their good friends and also a very accomplished angel investor and entrepreneur. All right, so let's dive into some of their stuff, and we'll see what I think.
There's people that have made hundreds of millions of dollars once or twice, but there's 20 people that have made more than $1 billion more than once. It was really, really interesting looking at that list. There are people in there like Jim Getz, Alfred Lin, Danny Reimer, Jan Hammer, Fenton. And if you look, not a single one came up through the ranks as a pure engineer or product manager. Very few percentages of them were actually founders. A huge percentage of them were trained in banks and other places. Commercial people in venture are the ones that make the money.
They were investment analysts
I can
in
share you the
public
list,
markets before they became venture investors. Or Mike Moritz, who was an
journalist, yeah.
So if you look at all of these folks that are tier one people, the one common thread amongst all those folks is that unbelievably commercial.
So this kind of speaks to my heart a little bit because I wasn't an engineer. I didn't study computer programming. I love technology, but I've been a venture investor pretty much my whole career. I'm very much like more commercially trained, if that makes sense. And there's this big debate within venture where a lot of people are like, the very best VCs, they were engineers first, they were founders first, they were product managers first, and they were operators. And really, if you want a good VC, like you want somebody that's been there, done that on the entrepreneur side. And what Chamath is saying is like, yeah, that's great and all, but like some of the best, and arguably most of the best, actually have like more of a commercial, financial training background than they do like being an actual founder and so forth. And I wonder why that might be. My impression is that it's because you have this mindset of like, I'm driving for really great returns and outcomes, and I'm very much financially focused, and I don't have this like belief that I know better or that I could do better in the company. Like sometimes I've heard entrepreneurs like kind of complain about VCs that bring a lot of operational experience because they get in and they're like, I can do this better. Like I did this at my startup, and they start telling the CEO what to do. And the reality is like their experience isn't relevant anymore. And it's really hard for them to like take a back seat. Whereas if you've never been in that seat before, you might be limited in terms of the advice you can give when they hit certain problems related to operating the business, but you're also not going to have that temptation to like get involved where frankly you don't belong, and you can be more helpful in areas where the founder may have less expertise, right? So like thinking about like, when do you sell and for how much, and how do you navigate public markets, and how do you build this business in such a way that public market investors are going to be excited to invest. Anyways, I just thought that was interesting. I kind of want to go through the underlying data set and look at it. So maybe I'll do that and post a video about it on the future. All right, let's check out another one.
Stripe basically takes a 50% haircut, which is the single best run, most highly valued company in Silicon Valley. Again, that's going to eviscerate
Private company. Yeah.
a lot of TVPI in a lot of people's portfolios, a lot of theoretical money that LPs were going to get.
So what is he talking about there? So Stripe, like you said, is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, and best well-run private companies in Silicon Valley. Fun fact, it actually wasn't started in Silicon Valley. It was started in Ireland, of all things. But transitioned over to the US. And if you don't know who Stripe is, I guarantee that you've used their product before because they power the payment rails for like so many different applications and apps and so on and so forth. So last valuation was like almost $100 billion valuation. And they just raised $6.5 billion at a $50 billion valuation. And what he's saying there is he's like, that's going to hurt TVPI and DPI and so on and so forth. What he's saying is there are a bunch of venture funds that put money into Stripe, right? And their investors were invested in these venture funds. And those venture funds that, bought into Stripe really early on have seen like phenomenal gains, right? Over the last decade that they were investors in Stripe. And so some of these venture funds are sitting on like these massive paper write-ups on Stripe. And then all of a sudden you take all those paper gains and you cut them in half. Like that is brutal. And all of a sudden like it flows all the way back. So, the investors in these venture funds just had the valuations that they were expecting. Like they were expecting Stripe to go public here, a couple of years ago, really. I mean, maybe a year ago. And now we hit this wall on valuations, and they just got cut in half, which means like their portfolio's down 50%. And it's going to be harder for them to raise these venture funds to raise more money and so forth. So it's going to have this like trickle down effect. And with a company that's as big as Stripe, that's $50 billion of value that just like evaporated overnight. And for some of these funds, like that is insanely meaningful. Not to mention those that invested at higher valuations than the 50 billion and are now underwater and losing money.
Tiger wrote down the value of their private book by 33% for 2022. And so, I think Tiger's AUM basically has gone from 100 billion to 50 billion in a year.
Okay, so I remember reading this in the news. I think it's super interesting. I wish there was a little more commentary on Chamath's thoughts here, but I'll share my thoughts. I think a lot of people are looking at Tiger and saying, this is like what you deserve. Because in 2021, a lot of people kind of point their finger at Tiger Global as the ones that kind of like help spur the like run up in the bubble of 2021 in terms of like tech stocks, especially on the private markets. Because what Tiger did, and their model was super interesting, brilliant in my mind. And I'm going to explain why I actually don't think they're in such a bad spot. But the first thing you have to understand about Tiger is that they're a hedge fund and they have access to like huge capital reserves, right? The ability to raise money and tons of money, like tens of billions of dollars. So what they did is they went to Bain Consulting. And Bain Consulting is like, their business model is they go and they hire the very smartest people and they then rent their brains effectively. Like they rent those people to companies to solve problems for them. And so Tiger Global went to Bain and they said, we're going to pay you $100 million a year. Like crazy amount of money. And we want your people to go find the very best companies that are out there, right? Go find them, do all the diligence you can on them that's possible, and then report back to us. And so then Bain Capital will come back to them and be like, okay, here are the companies that in all of these different industries that we think are the winners. Like we're just kind of picking like in this industry, this is the company. In this industry, it's this company. In this industry, it's this company, okay? And then what Tiger Global would do is they would call up these companies and they'd be like, hey, interested in investing in your business. I just need to confirm a few numbers, right? Because they didn't have insider information to these companies. So they confirm a few numbers and then they'd make them an offer right then on the spot. And it was usually like a super competitive offer, like a much higher valuation than the entrepreneur was hoping that they were going to get when they raised their next round of capital. And then on top of that, Tiger would be like, you know what? I'm not going to take a board seat and I'm going to close in 2 weeks. This is like an entrepreneur's dream. I don't have to spend 6 months begging VCs for money. I get the valuation I want, maybe even the better valuation than I expected. I don't have to give it a board seat up, which is, the board's whole job is like to hire and fire a CEO. So like that can be terrifying to a CEO to give up another board spot. So they don't have to do that. And I don't have to wait 3 months for them to do confirmatory due diligence. They're just going to write a check and they're going to write a big check. And so Tiger Global started doing this and they started just snapping up deals left and right. Some of the best companies out there. And other VCs were freaking out because they were like, holy crap, Tiger is moving so fast. They're giving super beneficial terms. How do I keep up? How do I compete with this? And so a lot of VCs were super critical. They're like, there's no way that they're going to be able to survive this. What's going to happen? eventually like there's going to be a downturn and they're totally going to get crushed. And that's effectively kind of like what Chamath is saying, is that like they're down 50%. But here's my read on it. And that is, as I think about it, like what other types of investors up and down the venture stack act the way Tiger was? Seed investors do. They don't really care so much about valuation. They don't take board seats. They move relatively quickly, right? They don't need to do a ton of due diligence. And what Tiger was effectively doing, in my opinion, is they were pushing out the risk curve. They were saying, okay, I'm going to invest in this company at $1 billion valuation, which is a high valuation, much, potentially higher than it's really worth, right? Just like a seed investor would invest at a company worth $3 million or $5 million when all it is like, two women in a garage with a napkin as an idea of like what they're going to build, right? And so, like, is it really worth 3 million, 5 million, 10 million? Probably not, right? But you don't care because, like, the upside is so big. And I think Tiger was basically saying that. They were saying, you know what? We're going to place a lot of bets. And our goal is we want to be in every unicorn. In fact, there was a lot of speculation, which borne out to be true, that if you took all of the unicorns, private companies worth over $1 billion, and you said individually, are they overvalued? And yes, like, for the most part, they were undervalued individually. But then if you took them together as a group, all of them, they were probably undervalued. And that actually bore out to be true, because if you were an investor in all, $1,000 billion, unicorns, eventually there became companies like Stripe that went from being worth, $1 or $2 billion to being worth, even this latest round where they took a huge down round, being worth $50 billion. Well, that's huge, right? So basically, that's the game that Tiger was playing. It's like, hey, we're going to make a bunch of investments in these companies. And then what we're going to do is we're going to watch them. And we're going to hope that there are a few that we invested at $1 billion that turn into $100 billion companies. And we're going to move so fast and we're going to have such good terms that we're going to get into the very best unicorns. And guess what? Our downside is lower than a typical seed fund. Because a typical seed fund, like, they go through this exact same thing. So in a typical seed fund, like, you lose your losers early, like fast, right? Like, the companies start and they can't get any customers and they die, right? They're just dying. And they just go straight to zero. You just lose all your cash. And then it takes a while, right, before like your winner or two, and usually it's only one or two winners, like ends up being like wildly successful. The benefit that Tiger has that a seed fund doesn't have is that the market is still relatively liquid for the companies that they've backed. So they can sell them to other investors, potentially at a discount, right? But it's not a full write-off. And that's actually, if you pay attention to what Tiger's doing today, that's kind of what they're doing. They're going through and they're like triaging things, and they're kind of getting rid of the companies that they don't think are very good, that have the potential to generate a huge return. And my guess is that they're holding on tight to the companies that are really strong and still have that potential to achieve a good return. And so, look, it could totally be the case that Tiger loses like half of their portfolio or sells it off at a loss or what have you, or even more, maybe it's like 75%, right? And it still ends up generating such a huge return on the remaining 25% that their fund ends up performing really well. Because as we know today, like, companies getting to 100 billion, that used to be like, one deal every 5 years could do that. But now it's like more and more and more, because the global market's so big that it can sustain these businesses. Anyways, let me know what you think. Is Tiger like totally disaster? Am I totally wrong? They're not playing this game and they're going to go out of business? Or do you have a different perspective on it? And what do you think about the All In podcast? Should I keep doing reacts like this? Let me know. Thanks.